It's good to see each one this evening. We'd remind you again of the question period that'll follow. And if you have questions as we go through the sessions, you might make some notes, and then we'll see if we can find some answers. This evening we're talking about the fossil record. I enjoy talking about the fossils. One of my favorite subjects. If I'm going to debate creation evolution, usually you have to narrow the field in order to have a reasonable debate. This is what I want to talk about. The proposition would be that the fossil record is more compatible with creation than evolution. And we have debated that on several occasions. I think they have pretty well stopped doing that, and I think I understand why. The last one was scheduled at LSU with the head of the, and I'm getting some signals here, is that okay? It had been scheduled for at least 6 months with the head of the geology department at LSU. They're in the middle of the geology building, big auditorium. We were all looking forward to it. And auditorium was full, over 400 people in a 300-seat auditorium. And the professor didn't show up, head of the department. So I won. Lectured for about an hour, had Q&A for another hour. Some of them stayed till midnight. One of the interesting things was it was put on by Campus Crusade. They had handed out cards, made people fill out cards when they came in, and asked the question, are you creationist or evolutionist? As they analyzed that, they found that 53% were creationist, which I think would be a disproportionate amount on a normal college campus that would indicate their interest in the subject. But they followed up 2 weeks later. That was the case when they came in. 2 weeks later, it was 87% were creationists. They'll teach him not to show up. We do enjoy talking about the fossil record, and I think that's powerful evidence for the fact that God thinks sin is serious, and it's an indication of his judgment. Consider the statement by S.M. Stanley of Johns Hopkins University, which I think is critical as we begin to look at the evidence. He says, it's doubtful whether in the absence of fossils, the idea of evolution would represent anything more than an outrageous hypothesis. They don't have the fossils. Yeah, that's his analysis, an outrageous hypothesis. I don't think they have the fossils, and I think we can show that. He goes on to say the fossil record, and only the fossil record, provides direct evidence of major sequential changes in the Earth's biota. If you're going to prove evolution, this is where it's at. This is where you would have to go to prove that this happened. But as we think of the proof that would be involved from fossils, consider the statement by Ernst Mayr of Harvard, one of the more famous biologists in the country. Evolutionary biology, in contrast with physics and chemistry, is a historical science. The evolutionist attempts to explain processes that have already taken place. Experiments are inappropriate techniques. So this is not hard science, so to speak. Instead, one constructs a historical narrative consisting of tentative reconstruction. This is the only direct evidence there is, and when you get through with it, even if it proved the point, you wouldn't have absolute proof. It's a tentative story. But let's look at the evidence and see which view is favored. How would you look at the fossil record and distinguish between creation and evolution? What would you expect to see as an evolutionist or as a creationist? I think there are predictions, and this is one of the ways you proceed in science. You test models by making predictions and see which one then proves to be consistent. There are contrasting predictions from the two views. The beginning, I think, is the most critical part of the evidence, and we'll spend a good bit of time looking at the beginning of that fossil record. The evolutionist would predict a simple, gradual beginning, whereas the creationist says, boom, that's the way it is. That is, the complex, abrupt, diverse picture is what we would expect to see in the beginning. Progressing upward, there would be the kinship, the allied continuum, the progression. On the other hand, stasis, that is, staying the same, distinct, separate picture is what we would predict. So as you look at the two, you should be able to see which one fits the facts best. Both would predict similarities for different reasons. The evolutionist, because it would gradually develop from a common origin. The creationist predicts similarities because there's a common designer. And you would see a different pattern. You would see a branching pattern if it all came from a common ancestor. A mosaic pattern, putting a blue tile here where you need it, designing a blue tile there where it's needed, not necessarily connected or branching. So a different pattern would be seen. Well, how are we going to determine what is in the fossil record? I can tell you, and a lot of people would say, well, you're a creationist, you're prejudiced. We're going to allow the evolutionist to do the description of the evidence. And sometimes people misunderstand what we're doing, that you're not being fair, you're quoting evolutionists. Well, that's really the point. When you understand testimony from a friendly witness will help. If he's saying the accused is honest, there's no reasonable motive to lie, that's beneficial, but then that's a friend. You expect him to say that. On the other hand, if the evidence comes from an antagonistic witness, then that statement really means something. In legal terminology, you have testimony from a friendly witness, you have acknowledgments contrary to interest, as they put it. That is much more weighty. And that's what we're going to be looking at, the acknowledgments contrary to interest, the statements, the acknowledgments of the evolutionist. All of the quotations, unless we make exceptions, and if we do, we'll bring attention to it, all of the quotations are from devout believers in evolution. They're from men of great faith, but faith in evolution. As an example, right at the beginning, we see Richard Dawkins of Cambridge, perhaps the leading spokesman for the evolutionist today, talking about the beginning of the fossil record. We find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution the very first time they appear. Now, it's a state of evolution, but boom, there they are, and that's the first time you see them. How do you know that's a stage of evolution? Because there's no history leading to it. Obviously, he has assumed that, contrary to the evidence. It's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted the creationist. I would plead guilty. Yes. And another way of saying that is it meets our predictions. It does not meet his predictions. When we look at the beginning, we see the description, for example, here in National Geographic, no friend to the creationist, as an explosion of life, the Cambrian period, the bottom layer, as they define the bottom layer, is an explosion of life according to their description. Stephen Gould, again one of the more prolific science writers, recently deceased, but for 30 years wrote the lead article on evolution in natural history, and of course professor at Harvard. The Cambrian explosion, describing what happened to life at the beginning, it just boom, there it is, occurred in a geological moment all major anatomical designs may have made their evolutionary appearance at that time. Nothing and then all. And that's evolutionary. That's not evolutionary at all. It's the opposite. But he's asserting that all appeared in an explosion of life, and you've got all the different designs, all the major phyla. Not only the phylum Chordata, that's us with backbones, but also all of the major divisions of the Chordata. Contrary, he says, to Darwin's expectations, what we see is not what Darwin predicted. Now, that's just words right out of his mouth. And it gets worse than that for him. Since the so-called Cambrian explosion, no new phyla. The phyla is the major division in biology. We got them all, boom, no history before, and there have been no new ones since. Now, what does that look like? That doesn't look like the gradual progression from a simple beginning. Maxwell Maltz, University of Texas, a leading authority in the field, says the Cambrian explosion, it wasn't, that's what Darwin predicted, but it wasn't a gradual development of complexity, Maltz said. These things seem to burst out of a magic box. You catch him in an unguarded moment, and yep, that's what it looks like, though he is a devout evolutionist. The beginning is described more recently in evolutionary biology this way. Fossils from the Cambrian period can cause a real headache for evolutionary biologists. Now, it's another way of saying it does not fit what we expect. That's not our prediction. They expect simple organisms evolving over time to become increasingly more complex. However, during the Cambrian period, there was an apparent explosion of the different major groups of animals, all appearing simultaneously in the fossil record, comparable to the morphological variety of their living cousins when we first encountered them in the Cambrian fossil record. They're like the ones we got today. Boom, there it is. Nothing before and no new ones after. Now, what does that sound like to you? I mean, if I had written the text, I don't think I could have made it up to sound more like creation than the words out of the evolutionist's mouth. Here, May 18, Text Geology, the fossil record of early animals has been documented as an early Cambrian explosion of the metazoan body plans. Plans evidenced by stratigraphic first occurrence of fossils, almost all animal phyla. All of the major divisions of biology, not just in the Cambrian, but in the early Cambrian. That's the lowest part of the lowest layer, all of them, and no new ones since. Now, that would cause a headache if you're trying to document Darwinism from the fossil record. We can summarize it this way, as that explosion, in their words, bursting out of a magic box, complex, suddenly, right at the start, a real headache for the evolutionary biologist. They're advanced, just planted there without any evolutionary history. All the major anatomical designs, the Chordata, all of its major divisions, and since the Cambrian, no new phyla. Words from the evolutionist themselves, not from the creationist. Now, a lot of people just go home. That's so obvious. But that's not what's in the textbook, as many of you know. This is the picture you see in the biology textbook, beginning with the simple, gradually developing upward. The Chordata is what you see at the top, which is what was at the bottom. You could turn it upside down and it would be better. And it has gone downhill, as we've documented earlier this week. And so when we see this description, that's just the opposite. Now, we don't need to go through that again. Let's skip to the next one. This is what's represented in the textbook. And let's move forward here. Consider the statement by David Rapp that we've quoted earlier from the University of Chicago, from the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. In the years since or after Darwin, his advocates hoped to find predictable progressions. These, in general, have not been found. Darwin looked at it and he said, well, yeah, here's this sudden beginning, and you don't see connected progressions, but given more time, and there's been, 170, almost 200 years, you'll close the gaps. Well, no, that has not been found, as this leading authority says. Gould refers to these trees that appear in the geologic textbooks and the biology textbooks. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The branches that connect them are not there. The rest is inference, however reasonable, but not the evidence of the fossils. Now, there's not a higher authority in geology, paleontology, than Stephen Gould, and that's his flat-footed statement. In fact, in his book, The Wonderful Life, he diagrams it this way. He says the beginning for the evolutionist is predicted to be slow and gradually progressing upward. That looks like evolution. He said that's not the case at all. They have turned that cone upside down, and it started more diverse and bigger, and it's gone downhill, losing diversity and various species to a lower point. Now, that's just as upside down as it can be. They have turned the traditional interpretation on its head. They have inverted the cone, and that's from Stephen Gould. Yet, here's what we see in the textbook. The progression upward, and that's not what's there. Now, where do we get this tree? Well, let's let them describe the source of the tree. From the textbook Evolution of the Earth, I was taught from at 2 different state universities. We have arranged the groups in a traditional way with the simplest forms first. Does that sound familiar? You were here last night. They arranged it to look this way. We arranged it with the traditional way with the simplest forms first and progressively more complex groups following. This particular arrangement is arbitrary. That is, it's not what you see in the fossils, but we drew it that way. Now, I want to be as fair as I can be, and as he goes on that page, you'd think, why would he leave it like that as he's trying to sell evolution? He goes on to give an explanation of how and why they got this tree. Things are alike because they're related. And on that basis, they build the tree, not the fossils. It's the opposite of the fossils. The less they look alike, the further they are removed from their common ancestors. So that, with that assumption, which is really assuming the thing to be proved, they build the tree, as we saw with the geologic column. And so when we're talking about fossils, really, you're just talking about dead things in rocks. In order to make them say something, you've got to have some assumptions to arrange them, and this is it. Similarities. That's the primary issue regarding creation and evolution. Otherwise, you just got dead things in rocks. Beginning with the assumption that evolution is indicated by similarities, and you can arrange things that way. And you look at fossils and skeletons, and you see any similarities there? Well, yeah, that's you can see differences, but just be honest, the similarities are more striking. The question is why? Of course, the evolutionist doesn't ask that question. He knows, and it's not a question. Why is it similar? Well, it could be common ancestry, or it could be something else, couldn't it? Well, were these houses cousins? That's not why they look similar, is it? Common genetics is not a good explanation there. Common designer is obviously better. We look in the textbooks at similarities arranged here in the pendactyl form of the vertebrate hand. The hand, the bones are arranged in a similar way in all of these critters. Why? Well, the evolutionist, again, doesn't ask that. He just asserts that it's because of common genetics. I think common ancestor, that is common designer, would explain it just as well. In fact, I think we can explain it better. Homology is the picture. That's a fancy word that says here are similarities that are because of common ancestry. But you do not see homologous genes. That is, the bones here, see, we can explain as well as they can, but when you look at genetics, their explanation begins to break down. The hand, if it's from common genetics, ought to come from the same part of the embryo as it's developing genetically. But we look at the newt hand and the lizard hand, and they're similar, but they come from totally different parts of the embryo. Man's hand comes from still another part of the embryo. Sir Kevin de Beer, professor of embryology at Oxford and director of the British Museum of Natural History, says the attempt to find homologous genes has been given up as hopeless. Homologous bones, okay, you can arrange them now, but it doesn't work with genes, so that we've got an advantage. It's not that we can just explain the similarity as well, but I think we can do it better, especially when you look at the embryology and the genetics. But this is the typical representation based on similarities, some similarities, not all. And as long as we're talking about similarities, let's talk about what you often hear as an argument. Apes and men, especially men, chimpanzees, very, very similar. Here's Richard Dawkins saying chimpanzees and we share more than 99% of our genes. That was 35 years ago. That's woefully out of date, and it wasn't justified in the first place. But this is his conclusion 34 years ago. Bill Nye, the Science Guy, in 2014, long after this had been refuted, repeats the same thing. As our understanding of DNA has increased, we have come to understand we share around 98% of our gene sequences with chimpanzees. Anybody ever heard that? If you've been in school lately, that's one of the main things they will tell you. And in Bill Nye's debate, this was one of his major points. Well, we just look at what has been documented since that time here, 2007. The title of the article, Relative Differences, the Myth of the 1% Difference. Relative difference, 1%, that's a myth. Studies are showing that humans and chimps are not as similar as many tend to believe. The chunks of missing DNA, extra genes, altered connections, the very structure of chromosomes. Our chromosomes are different, structured. That confounds any quantification of humanness versus chimpness. How do you quantify that? 1%, 2%? You can't even compare it because they're different types of chromosomes. That was 2007. In Nature, 2010, another article is even more severe in its criticism of the idea. Comparison now reveals they differ radically in sequence structure, in gene content. Their chimpanzee genome is 10 to 15% longer. That sound like a 2% difference? 50% of the human genes were missing from the chimp. Now, wait a minute. We're supposed to be 2% difference, and 50% of the human genes were missing. 1/3 more categories, entirely different classes of genes. There is just no, it makes nonsense of the claim, no excuse for it at all. In fact, the more we look at it, the more absurd it gets. The creationist predicts that there would be similarities. We live in the same world. We breathe the same air. We eat the same types of food. The ecosystem shows that we're involved in the same process, life processes, and so there would have to be similarities for us to have food to eat. Obvious similarities, for example, that was published recently, we have share half our genes with the banana. And then this is earlier this year, we share 63% of our genes with the fruit fly. Yeah, we're similar. We expect that. It would have to be. But similarities don't mean what they would preach that it means. One very obvious example would be places where similarities don't fit the evolutionary picture at all. We look at these two fish and they look similar, right? I see some heads nodding, and that means I caught you, because they're neither one fish. They look like fish, but they're not. One is a reptile, the other is a mammal. They're not related in the sense that one's a reptile, one's a mammal. Not related at all. And so, yes, we can say similarity indicates common ancestry, except when it doesn't. And then, very obviously, it doesn't. So the argument proves too much, proves nothing. In fact, it gets just really absurd when we begin to look at, and similarities, that's the key issue when you're trying to talk about fossils. Who are man's relatives if we look at the closest similarities? Well, we're often referred to blood serum, and yep, the chimpanzee has very similar blood serum, and if you use the right anti-serum, the right conditions, you can actually utilize chimpanzee blood serum. That's very, very similar. You look at the outside structure, we won't get personal, but we can see similarities with some of the apes. But then that's not a consistent picture. If we're talking about milk chemistry, no, chimpanzee milk just does not work. It's very different. The closest, well, you could say is the donkey. It's much, much closer than the ape. But now then we've learned that milk chemistry is very interesting, and we have some milk that's just much more nutritious than human milk, or certainly cow milk. The cockroach. Can you believe that? They've shown cockroach milk is 3 times more nutritious than cow milk. Here from Science News, got milk. Roach milk could be a new superfood. Cockroach milk is among the most nutritious substances on Earth, 3 times richer in calories than buffalo, the previous top contender. It doesn't work too well when we're looking at all of the similarities. What about cholesterol? Anybody concerned about their cholesterol level? Well, we share that with not the chimpanzee, but with the garter snake, who has cholesterol problems like we do. In terms of teeth, now this is very easily preserved and often found in the fossil records, so can we compare teeth? Fish have much closer similarities with humans, like the sheep's head, for example. Now, we look at apes, and their teeth are quite different from human teeth, but you look at the sheep's head, some of you might be a little envious there. Those are pretty good-looking teeth, aren't they? The parrotfish likewise has very similar teeth, much more so than the apes. And so if you want to look at similarities with teeth, it's not the ape, it's the fish. What about foot structure? We're concerned about that down at Glen Rose with the fossil footprints, and some would say, well, maybe they were made by apes, which wouldn't help. They're supposed to be far removed from the dinosaurs as well, but the ape has a hand for a foot. They don't look like human feet at all, but there are animals that do have feet like ours. The glacial bear, for example, if you take the claws out and all of that extra padding, the skeletal structure is, without the claws, it's just almost identical. You can hardly tell the difference. You sure can with the ape, but not the glacial bear. In terms of tear enzyme, very complex enzyme, complex arrangement of hundreds of amino acids in a precise sequence. Well, the chicken has the same lysosome that we have, the tear enzyme. It needs it to fight bacteria where the egg is being produced. We need it in our eyes to fight bacteria exposed to outward surfaces. Same complex chemical. And likewise also in the nematode, the elegans, it has the same tear enzyme. Blood antigen A, who's our closest relative there? The butterbean has blood antigen A, like we do. And what about brain hormones? We're pretty proud of our brain. Who has brain hormone like us? You just hold on to your seat. Here he comes again, the cockroach. This is from Discover magazine. Don't squash that roach. He may be your cousin. Cockroach and man, it seems, share a, not similar, but common brain hormone. I like to talk about similarities because it completely explodes their story when you look at the whole picture. And what we're looking at is not a branching pattern. We're looking at a mosaic pattern. The blue tile here where it's needed, whether it's with the chicken or with the butter bean, and the blue tile wherever the Creator needs it is seen, but not in this connected branching pattern. So, summarizing then, looking at the beginning. The beginning is complex and abrupt and diverse. An explosion, no new phyla since then. The trees, selected similarities can be shown, but when you look at all the similarities, it really makes a mess. And overall, it's just very different. They're not from fossils or from embryology or genetics. They're from similarities that are selected. So, we see similarities, a mosaic pattern, not a branching pattern. I think we see very definite advantages for the creationist in trying to explain this, whether you're talking about the beginning or the trees or the similarity. In all of those instances, it favors creation. But as we move on from the beginning, up the column, so to speak, transitional forms would be how you would see evolution. It goes from this one to this one to this one, and that would show evolution, which is what you would have to have. Well, how many times do we see that? Well, Darwin certainly didn't see it. In Origin of the Species, he says innumerable transitional forms must have existed. Now, this is a quotation from Origin of the Species by Darwin. Why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? Why not every geological formation, every stratum full of such intermediate? Everything got here by transitional form. We ought to see them all over the place. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. It is the greatest objection which can be urged against my theory. This is not in favor, Darwin said. Darwin said this is the biggest objection there is against the theory of evolution. Did you know Darwin said that? They told you in the textbook about No, they told you the opposite. Niles Eldridge, that we talked about earlier, the curator of the American Museum of Natural History, deals with the prediction. Darwin said just give us some more time and we'll fill in the gaps. He is curator of the American Museum of Natural History, over 32 million fossil specimens. He says Darwin, prophesied future generations of paleontologists would fill in these gaps by diligent search. It would become abundantly clear that the fossil record will not confirm this part of Darwin's predictions. Nor is the problem a miserably poor record, which some say, well, we just haven't collected enough. The fossil record simply shows that this prediction was wrong. 32 million specimens have been collected and cataloged, and it shows the prediction was wrong, according to the leading authority, or certainly one of the leading authorities. Derek Ager was president of the British Geological Association when he made this statement. He said, "It must be significant that nearly all the evolutionary stories I learned as a student have now been debunked." You've seen the Mythbusters maybe on TV. That's what has happened with the fossil record. Again, from David Rep of the Chicago Field Museum of Natural History, Darwin was embarrassed by the fossil record. I don't tell you that in the books, but he acknowledges that. Because it didn't look the way he predicted it would. It embarrassed him. Well, we're now 120 years after Darwin. The knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, and the situation hasn't changed much. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. It's gone downhill because we've debunked a lot of it. By this I mean the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse, had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. Did you know that had been discarded? It's still in your textbooks, but we know better, as he acknowledges. We'll look more at that in a moment. One of the examples of the transitional form that we see often, and this is recently in the news, they found a four-legged whale, according to National Public Radio, Newsweek announced it, New York Post, BBC. Well, there he is. And how do we get whales? Well, they were on land and they went back to sea and had legs and they finally lost them. This would be a transitional form, wouldn't it? Well, let's look at what was reported here. National Public Radio discovered fossils of a four-legged whale, raptor-like eating style. Newsweek said that it had a jackal-like head, lived on land and sea, four-legged whale. Again, New York Post, four-legged whale found in Egypt. BBC, four-legged whale discovered. They all are saying that. Well, what did they find? There it is. No legs. But they're all reporting it that way, and that's, once you get to the technical literature where it describes what was actually found, this is their diagram. You remove the drawing, and that's what's left. And they're all saying it's a four-legged whale. Maybe it had flippers. How do you know? You can't tell. Is it related to whales? You can't tell from that. Impossible to know. But what are they reporting? You read it. Well, four-legged whale, there's the picture. What I'm saying is they don't tell the truth. And it's not hard to document. The horse story that several of them had referred to has had to be discarded. This is the picture that you see in the textbook. If you include that 9-foot donkey we excavated out there at Lubbock that we talked about, that kind of messes up the picture, doesn't it? You start with Hydrocatherium up at the top, which when he was first found had absolutely nothing to do with horses. In fact, the word Hydrocatherium means like a hydrax. That's like a rock badger. That was named in 1840 by English paleontologist, who's a devout creationist, by the way. But now then, 2016, it's the first horse. Like a hyrax, that's what the name means. And it does look like a hyrax. That's a hyrax. Well, yeah, I'd recognize that as a horse, wouldn't you? You think? Maybe if you put a saddle on him, you could. But that's not what that thing looks like. And several of the evolutionists said, wait a minute, this is not working too well. And so now then, in more up-to-date report in Wikipedia, the closest living relative to the elephant. Yeah, looks a lot like an elephant. If you sort of dress him up a little bit, that's not an elephant. He doesn't belong in the horse story at all. If you eliminate him, then it's very easy to explain the rest of the story, because you've got all of the rest of the story buried together in one spot in Ashfall National Park. The same five, I did all the 5 species, different toes, buried together in one ashfall. What we've got are hyraxes, and we've got horses, big ones and little ones, and we've got elephants, and they're different. And that's what the fossil record indicates. Some are more honest about this. George Gaylord Simpson certainly believes in evolution, from Harvard. He actually wrote the first book advocating for horse evolution in North America. He said the uniform continuous transformation of Hydrocatherium into Equus, so dear to the hearts of the generation of textbook writers, never happened in nature. And there is no higher authority on the subject than George Gaylord Simpson, and he said, nope, didn't happen. But it's still in the textbooks. Archaeopteryx is supposed to be a transitional form. He's half lizard, half bird, and this is a pretty good representation, a restoration of the fossil that is very well preserved, together with feathers that are beautifully preserved. We have a few specimens, but we're told, look at the edge of the wing, look, he's got claws, and so this proves he's kin to the reptiles. Well, you look at Hoatzin, which is a 100% bird down in South America. He's got claws just exactly like Archaeopteryx. And the real problem with Archaeopteryx is you find modern birds lower in the fossil record, as acknowledged here in Nature. Fossil bird shakes evolutionary hypothesis. Fossil remains of 2 crow-sized birds, 75 million years older, that's half again as old as Archaeopteryx, have been found. Paleontologist Texas Tech University, who found them, says they have advanced avian or bird features. Perfectly modern birds, half again as old as Archaeopteryx, but Archaeopteryx was supposed to lead to it. You see the problems they have? Already there before and before the dinosaurs. And of course, the dinosaurs were supposed to lead to birds. Well, the birds got there first, according to their interpretation. And where did the dinosaurs come from in the first place? Well, have you seen the ancestors? Well, notice the statement here from Science News, 2018. Dinosaurs originated with a bang. Sound familiar? First, there were no dinosaur tracks. Then there were many. This marks the moment of their explosion. It's amazing how clear-cut the change was from no dinosaurs to all dinosaurs was. Boom, there it is. Well, I think the floodwaters got up to where they lived and then buried them. But nothing leading up to it. The birds were there first, according to their interpretation, and certainly don't lead to the reptiles leading to the birds. When you try to find transitional forms, it just becomes a comedy of errors. You have to imagine feet on the whale and put elephant trunks on the hyrax. I mean, this is a clown act. Stephen Stanley of Johns Hopkins is more honest, one of the better-known paleontologists. In fact, the fossil record does not convincingly document a single transition from one form to another. He wrote several books with Stephen Gould and is a highly regarded paleontologist. Stephen Gould has recently passed away, is honored as probably the best-known paleontologist ever. His tome that he published just before he died, 2002, was the result of all of his research, his life's work. And this is supposed to be the authoritative, bottom line, last word in paleontology. And it wasn't what was expected. Stasis, I would say, would be the theme of it, and that has been described as the theme by most. Stasis, let's make sure we understand what that is. Wikipedia says stasis means little or no evolutionary change in a species. Stays the same, status quo. It comes from the Latin term, stasis, no change. Okay, that is not evolution. That's the opposite of evolution, and that's the primary signal of the fossil record. Quoting from his book, spread over millions of years, these samples record no net change with beginning and end points substantially the same. Millions of years, beginning, end, same thing. Then a conclusion of stasis rests on the presence of data, not absence. They will say, well, you don't document it. Maybe it's a gap. No. If you've got evidence here and you've got evidence millions of years later, according to their assumption, and it's the same, and it's the same all the way through, that's not a gap. That's the presence of data. Stasis is what the fossil record is saying. Stasis extended in overwhelming abundance, as every paleontologist knew. They're not saying it, but they knew that. He says they all knew it. It is the most common pattern in the fossil record. It is the primary signal of the fossil record. Darwin's expectations defined evolution as gradual change. In this context, stasis can only record sorrow and disappointment. Now, this is not me writing this. This is not a creationist saying. This is perhaps the most authoritative evolutionist of all time. You're looking for gradual change, you're going to be disappointed. An imperial signal of quite stunning contrariness. Empirical falsification. How many ways can you say it ain't there? The fossil record says the opposite. Well, that was 2002. Maybe in 20 years there's something gone on. Well, Donald Prothero is taking over the mantle as the leading paleontologist today. He's author of 5 geology textbooks, and if you're studying geology, that's where you start. He says many paleontologists came forward and pointed out the geological literature was one vast monument to stasis. Now, it wasn't just Gould, but many of them acknowledged that, with relatively few cases where anyone had observed gradual evolution. As Gould put it, it was the dirty little secret hidden in the paleontological closet. Paleontologists all over the world saw stasis was the general pattern, and that gradualism was rare, and that's where they draw feet on the on the fossil that's not there. It is still the consensus 40 years later. Now, he said it earlier than when he died, but hadn't been that long since he said it again. But now then, 40 years after Gould said it the first time, it's still the consensus. That's not just a rare example. That's not just somebody saying it and everybody else saying it. No, that is the consensus of paleontology. That's the general pattern. looking at the evaluation of the models, we see creation and the monument to stasis on one hand. It's the most common pattern, the primary signal, the consensus. On the other hand, transitional forms, you hunt hard, and some will say there's none. Others will say a few. But you compare the two models, and which one is served best by the evidence? Is that even a good question? You see why I like to talk about the fossil record and why they don't want to debate us anymore. They still believe it very devoutly, as is stated here in the book Plant Life Through the Ages. The theoretically primitive type eludes our grasp, but our faith postulates its existence. Our faith fails to materialize, but it's just a matter of faith. They don't. Here's Jim Westgate. Well, let's skip that and go on to. We're running out of time tonight. The faith of the evolutionist could be expressed this way: the substance of fossils hoped for, the evidence of links unseen. It's not there. What we do see is exactly what the creationist would expect. They have blind faith in spite of the evidence, which we'll summarize again. Here's, in the words of the evolutionist, Darwin's biggest problem, that's worse now. He was embarrassed by the fossil record. It's been debunked. It's a headache for the evolutionist. It brings sorrow and disappointment, imperial falsification, and blind faith still believes it. It delights the creationist. It's just as planted there. Advanced explosion, burst out of a magic box, mosaic similarities, a monument to stasis. That's not hard to add up, is it? You see where the weight of the evidence is from the evolutionists themselves. And without the fossils, what was it? An outrageous hypothesis? Amen. So that I can say scientifically that the fossil record favors creation. And that's not prejudice. That's fact that we can back up and demonstrate with the words of the evolutionists themselves. I think this is great evidence. And I think we need to take the fossils back. I think they belong to us. If you're here this evening and not a Christian, affirming faith in God who created this world and his Son gave his life to save you from sin, that is real and consequential. The fossil record actually demonstrates the consequence of sin. God won't put up with it. He will judge. He judged first by water. Next time it's going to be by fire, and you need to be ready. If you haven't rendered obedience, you need to do so now. And we encourage you to do that while we stand together and sing.